Good afternoon, everyone. So the greatest of pleasures today that I'll be introducing to you Dr. Lynn Lavallée. Consider Lynn to be one of the fiercest Indigenous scholars that we have in our country today. I'm so humbled and proud to call her my mentor and a friend. And for without her wisdom and guidance, I certainly would not be here today, as I would have never finished my PhD at Ryerson. So welcome, Lynn. Dr. Lynn Lavallée is Anishinaabe registered with the Métis Nation of Ontario. She has extensive university administrative experience, which she feels has been necessary in advancing Indigenous knowledge in the Academy and supporting Indigenous students, faculty, and staff. She began her academic career in 2005 at Ryerson University in the School of Social Work, and is currently a full professor in the Faculty of Community Services and is the strategic lead on Indigenous resurgence and also the director of the School of Social Work. She recently returned to Ryerson from the University of Manitoba, where she held the position of Vice Provost of Indigenous Engagement. Dr. Lavallée is the former chair of the Research Ethics Board at Ryerson University. Her research focuses on Indigenous health and well-being, addiction and mental health, methadone toxicology and opioid addiction, urban identity and their relationship to well-being, Indigenous research methodology and research ethics. She conducts both quantitative and qualitative research and developed a widely used Indigenous research method called Anishinaabe Symbol-Based Reflection, or ASBR. The focus of Dr. Lavallée's research is always in response to what community deems as important, and as a result, reciprocity and a strong social action are paramount to any of the activities that she undertakes. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Lavallée to the stage.
Bonjour, Annie. Minidulebe Quaidishnakas, Wawashkiji, and Dodum Sudbury Digital. Miigwet Sean for that wonderful introduction. It's nice, to have someone do an intro for you who knows you very well. So I didn't have to be harassed to send a bio, which was really nice. And miigwet to Rachel and Marina for inviting me here today and assisting with the activities. I have a clicker, right? Yeah. I must say, I woke up at 5 o'clock this morning and I was just outside of Sault Ste. Marie in a place called just outside of Lavallée, and drove here, and I'm here now. So, yeah, woo! I'm a little bit tired, but I'll try to give it my best for you since you've taken the time to come today. I also did not bring my regular glasses, so if I need to see the screen, this will happen. Or if I need to see you, this will happen. So I'm just forewarning you. Okay. Yep. We didn't rehearse this, as you can see. It's very important, I think, for Indigenous scholars who are in the Academy occupying spaces for Indigenous people to identify who they are, not just politically. So Sean mentioned I'm registered with the Métis Nation of Ontario, but it's also important for me to tell you who I am, who my people are, and where they come from. And we need to do that more and more because increasingly there's opportunity for Indigenous people, not only in the Academy, but in other organizations. And unfortunately, there's a lot of cultural fraud happening. And when people identify who they are, sometimes people identify as coming from a specific First Nation, being a member of a First Nation. Some people will say they're part of the Anishinaabe Nation, part of the Mi'kmaq Nation. But I need to tell you who I am and who my people are to understand when I speak, where is that coming from? So up on this slide, I have many of my family members. My father was Lavallée, and he was from the region of Timiskaming. Many generations were from that area. Last names include Gauthier, Pepin, Kaya, Keda, Richard, Taylor. My mom was born in Timmins, Ontario, and her mom was from Maniwaki, and the last names on my mother's mom's side are Labelle and Lafont. And my grandfather was from Swan Lake in Manitoba, and there the last names are Gonan and McIver. These are the territories. So Lavallée is actually named after my ancestors in Timiskaming, and my grandfather used to build boats and log cabins, and he would take people across from the Quebec side to the Canadian side for people who were working in the mines. And at the top, Swan Lake is where my grandfather is from, Gonan and McIver. And for anybody who understands the Métis identity issues right now, that's my Red River connection. So any MMF supporters here? You're not going to raise your hand. The MMF is Manitoba Métis Federation, and right now there's a bit of dialogue happening with respect to identity of Métis peoples in Canada, specifically after the Supreme Court ruling that identifies Métis being Aboriginal as per the Constitution, as such are entitled to benefits. In the middle, Sudbury, where I was born, I actually just drove through there about 4 hours ago, and we didn't stop there though. Maniwaki is where my grandmother was from, and Timmins is where my mom was from. I was born in Sudbury and moved to Regent Park in the 70s when I was young and really grew up in social housing. In Sudbury, we also grew up in social housing. And that's important because it says a lot about who I am and where I've come from. And I'm proud of that. I'm proud of the fact that I grew up in Regent Park. Oh, I did it again. Okay, as Sean said, I actually just want to acknowledge something first. I went to York University. I did my undergraduate here in kinesiology. Kinesiology then was, I can't actually remember what department it was at that time. It wasn't called kinesiology, it was called physical health and education actually. And I always really loved coming back to York because my experience here was absolutely wonderful in certain respects. And I was very connected. I ran track 1500 and cross country and was an athletic trainer, so I have a lot of really good memories here, which didn't really happen after my undergrad, when I carried on for my master's and my PhD. I recently returned from the University of Manitoba. I was the Vice Provost Indigenous Engagement, and I took that position on in September 2017. I was excited at the time. I know that these are colonial institutions. We receive our money from the government. We have to do what the government asks us to do. So it's very hard to remove ourselves from the colonial structures within the academy. But I was encouraged to see that the university was hiring its first Vice Provost Indigenous Engagement. It was one of, I think, Laurentian was the first university to identify such an academic position. And that was, you now have Dr. Sheila Cote-Meek here. And she started off, is Sheila in the room right now? Not yet. Or maybe not right now. I think she's very, very busy. But she's here now, and she was started at Laurentian University as their first vice president dealing with Indigenous initiatives at the university. After a year and 4 months, I resigned from that position, and it really had to do with my expectations of the position were not in alignment with the university's expectation of that position. And I'm a Lavallée, I have ties in Manitoba, I have relatives there, and my integrity, it matters most when I take on different roles within the institution. And before I got there, my friend from childhood, she lives there, and her son, who was actually murdered in Winnipeg, her son's partners, the mother of his child, she's from Barons River. People in Barons River said, "Hey, Lynn Lavallee's coming. She's going to change things, right? She's going to make it okay at the university," and that was my measure. So many things happened. I'll probably mention a few stories as I speak today, but fundamentally, ultimately, I resigned from that position because I felt my integrity was being challenged. Because in that role, it was slightly different than what's happening here at York University. I know a little bit about the position, special advisor to the president, special advisors to deans, and having more than one person actually taking on those activities is vital. So eventually resigned that position and was contacted by the media. I typically don't speak to media. Things get twisted and turned around.
And so I went to the media, and that was part of that integrity and responsibility. I felt I needed to actually say something because a few things hit the media anyway. And prior to my resignation, several other people resigned from Indigenous specific positions in institutions. So Angelique Eaglewoman was at Lakehead in the Faculty of Law. Sandra Muse-Isaacs was at St. Mary's University. Barry Lavallée, who's a relation probably 7 generations ago in Manitoba, who's an MD, he resigned about 2 months after me at the University of Manitoba. The Lavallées, we just cause heck wherever we go. And also, Marilyn Buffalo was at University of Alberta, I believe, and she was fired. And you know, I think that when you start to push those boundaries within the colonial walls, you sometimes reach a threshold of tolerance. And I believed I was reaching that threshold of tolerance, and I was worried I was going to get fired. As a Vice Provost Indigenous Engagement, I was not part of the union, and you don't really have academic freedom in that role, right? So I wanted to ensure that I was not fired as well. Okay, a bit of a trigger warning. I might use language that offends you. And one of the things I realized in going to the University of Manitoba, sometimes you have to be very clear on what you're talking about in order for people to understand. So I will be using terms such as settler fragility, white fragility, supremacy of whiteness, and white supremacy. And this is the experience of Indigenous students in the academy, racialized students in the academy, Black students in the academy, Indigenous faculty, Indigenous staff. And we have to name this. A little bit of a story, I was at a large meeting and I wanted to bring the Indigenous faculty together. There was no mechanism by which I could bring Indigenous faculty together. There were about 40 plus Indigenous faculty at the university, and I understand there's about 14 at York University. And I wanted to just gather people together, but I couldn't get the names of people because of privacy, right, FIPA. But we did our work, we found out who was where, and I wanted to bring folks together. But my provost said, well, maybe you should ask the other vice provosts, as well as the deans and directors. So I had to do a presentation about trying to bring the Indigenous faculty together. I just couldn't actually do it. So I did that, and in that room I was questioned about being divisive in trying to bring Indigenous faculty together. What I said there was, I need a forum, a way in which to bring Indigenous faculty together, so you know, I know who's out there, we can encourage different activities and just be supportive. Then I had another question, very, very similar. And how I answered that was, well, this is a form of micro-resistance. But really what I should have said is, this is white fragility. You are uncomfortable because I'm actually holding something that you are not invited to. And Indigenous people feel like this all the time in this institution. And I simply want a little piece, a slight little piece, like the reserves, right? Just a slight little piece of land, a slight little piece of space. And I was hit with white fragility, and I did not call it out. And I wish I should have, right? I think I had to call it out at that point, because I don't think the way I dealt with it was truthful, right? And we're talking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission time. Land acknowledgements, you know we have to go there, right? So I know Sean's done a lot of work about land acknowledgements here in the faculty and probably also at the university. And I pulled this actually from the Canadian Association of University Teachers. And they actually have a website where they list all of the land acknowledgements in territories where we have our universities. And this is the one that is currently posted for York University. I think I liked what you did, Rachel, in personalizing that connection to the land, right? It's one of the reasons I talked about my connection to York University too, right? A land acknowledgement in a slightly different way. But it's an opportunity for knowledge as well. How many people know what treaty number this is? Not looking at what's on the page though. Yeah, Treaty 13. right? You go to Manitoba, people will introduce themselves. I'm from Treaty 1, I'm from Treaty 6, right? We don't even know the numbered treaty here, right? A lot of people do not know that numbered treaty. 13, so you see 13 in the yellow. I think on the left-hand side, bottom green is 13A. On top of 13, I think, is number 18. And, but the history behind those treaties are the Williams treaties. The Williams treaties were disastrous for a community. Mississaugas of New Credit only got payout, I believe, in 2015 or 2000. Don't quote me on that, but it was fairly recent. But it's knowing that history. It's knowing the history of the treaties. And what does that mean, right? So Walmart right now, First Nations people who have a status card are entitled to not paying tax because of the treaties. It was an agreement. Walmart right now on Facebook. Facebook is, Indigenous people are all over Facebook. Right now, Walmart all over across Ontario is denying the status cards, right? That's reconciliation. Hayden King, I'm sure folks have seen this, but he spoke about regretting writing the territorial acknowledgement. And I think we've advanced quite a bit. But the first time I heard Ryerson's land acknowledgement, I thought, where did that come from, right? It's like, dish with one spoon, like who wrote that? I didn't question it. Then I heard it a second time. And I went to I got on my computer and I included Hayden and a couple of other people and I said, hey, I heard this land acknowledgement. Where did it come from? Mind you, I'm at the university as Anishinaabe Kwe, and not from this territory, but from Ontario. And I didn't know about this land acknowledgement that the university had created. But we had someone who was doing a presentation, and I went to them after and I said, hey, what did you say? What was that land acknowledgement? And they said, I don't know, right? What's the dish with one spoon? I don't know. Well, why did you say it? Well, I trusted this person and they gave it to me and I said it, right? So I think we've moved quite a ways from that. And I was talking with my friend over the weekend about, territory. And the challenge with land acknowledgement is, even though we have the treaties, we don't own the land, right? So we're starting off with this ownership idea that is foreign. We can't own the land. The land is where our first family is, right? We connect to the land in different ways. The land has medicines. But now we're forced, because of the reserve system, because of these land acknowledgement, to actually own land and attribute one nation to the ownership of that land. And the dish with one spoon attempts to recognize that there are more than one nation. There's more than one nation that has has been part of the Toronto territory. So obviously Hayden spoke about the land acknowledgements challenging the doctrine of discovery in Terra Nullius. A lot of times the land acknowledgements are empty, but that's definitely changing. And I actually think people should do the land acknowledgement, just to let you know. But one of the things that happens, I have an email right now in my inbox asking me to speak to somebody about how to do the land acknowledgement, and I don't have time. So I might write something and just say, hey, here's a link, and just, these are my thoughts about it, because what my thoughts about land acknowledgement will be different than Sean's thoughts about land acknowledgement, right? So it's challenging, when people feel uncomfortable doing a land acknowledgement and not understanding what to say. What I tell people is do your research, right? Find out where are the treaties, right? Is it unceded territory? I remember somebody actually put on their email that Toronto was unceded. I'm like, whoa, it's not unceded, right? So in trying to do something, if you get something wrong, that's not good either. So writing your own and understanding what you say. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I'm sure everybody knows what the TRC, about the TRC, and that came out of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. And the commissioners and the people working with the TRC gathered stories from survivors and thrivers of residential school so that their histories could be documented and these stories would not be destroyed. Right? It was the documentation of that truth. Reports were produced and released in 2015, and there were 94 calls to action. So 20 pages are the calls to action, and a lot of people are very familiar with the calls to action, but not as familiar with other things that are going on with the TRC. So I said here that the TRC came out of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. So prior to the TRC, the federal government was speaking to survivors of residential school in order that there be an individual settlement for people who had experienced abuse and horrendous things that happened in residential school. So that was called the independent assessment process. There's a link up there that you can see. I have quoted there, reconciliation. So Ryan McMahon is a comedian as well as an activist, and that's the terminology that he has used to talk about reconciliation and just, a play on words. But a lot of folks don't know that with the independent assessment process, stories were gathered and then people were compensated financially a certain amount based on how horrific their story was and how long they could prove they were in residential school. You had to prove it, right? You had to prove that you were in residential school. This is where I cannot read what I have up there, so I'm going to put these on. But the survivors were never told by the Secretariat what would happen to their records. They were not given the option to have their records stored with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right? They were two separate things. And what has happened is the people are dying, right? And their stories are being destroyed 10 years after collection. So these stories are being destroyed, but people did not have the option. Some people did not want their stories shared. They did not want their family members, their nieces, their nephews, their children to hear about the horrendous abuse that might have happened, right? Can you imagine being sexually abused as a child for years and years and years, and then your child finding out about that, right? In a way that you don't intend. So rightfully so, some people do not want those records disclosed, but some people do. But there's a fight. There's a fight happening, and I'm sorry, I'm not sure right now of the outcome, but it should be, actually I do know the outcome, so I'll get to that. Who are we fighting? Take a look. And this is where I have to put the glasses on again. Presbyterian Church in Canada wants the records destroyed. Anglican Church. Women's Missionary Society of the Presbyterian Church. Baptist Church. Anglican Church, as I said, Archdiocese of Algoma. We were there, right? I just came from Algoma, and I was in a cemetery because the Building Reconciliation Forum was at Algoma University. Algoma University, the structure of Algoma University, 1934, was built. It was a residential school. Children died in residential school. There's a cemetery there. The Archdiocese name appears in the cemetery, but yet they're fighting to have the records destroyed related to the independent settlement process. In that cemetery, there was a man who, an elder who was sitting there, and he was a resident of the residential school, 1952 or 53 to 59. And he was talking about, the cemetery and the children who were in that cemetery. And there were monuments in that cemetery, and there was a big monument with a nice big cross, and it had a metal black fence around it to protect it. That was a person in the residential school who actually impregnated students, more than one student, and he's in that cemetery. There were other monuments. There were some monuments of young babies, young children, right? Well, a year and 4 months is a baby who died, and unfortunately, a lot of the plots where people were buried, that's a joke, that's an inside joke, where people were buried, This is the thing about Indigenous humor. We find humor where people would think it's the most inappropriate time. I'm talking about a cemetery and I'm cracking a joke. It's how we deal. We have to have that humor in order to deal. But the children who were there, they didn't get those monuments, so they got wooden crosses. Well, those wooden crosses deteriorated. So there's no way of telling where those children are, who the children are. Well, they can tell somewhat who the children are, but where the children were buried. There you go. There in the church there's a list of the children who died, who are in that cemetery. But the survivor, the thriver, he talked about the fact that those records aren't very accurate, because when a child died, they wouldn't tell the federal government, the Indian agent, because they got money for each head. And if someone died in September, they wouldn't get money. So they would report the death maybe in June, right? So they would continue to get that money. So there's real question as to the accuracy of the records of the children who died in residential school. More. These are the people who are fighting to have the records destroyed. There's a handful, or maybe two handfuls, of Indigenous people who are fighting to have their records destroyed. But as an individual, they can have their record destroyed. They should have that choice. But this is the complete list of people who are fighting to have the records destroyed. Unfortunately, the records are being destroyed because each individual has to actually state that they want their records kept. And can you imagine, you've gone through and you've collected stories from people and you're trying to recontact individuals so they can decide whether they want their records sent to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, where it will be kept forever. Truth and Reconciliation Commission, people really recognize the 92 calls to action, or 94 calls to actions with the 20 pages. But there are many reports, and if you don't read all of them, read the Missing Children and Unmarked Burials. Read that one if you don't read any other one. There's a total of 3,000 pages, but people are focusing on 20 pages with the calls to action, right? This is the truth, right? This is what should be in the classrooms. So we talk about curriculum development. Can you imagine? You could have a degree with respect, and include all of these materials, right? But really, take a dive deep. They're all available online at the nctr.ca. TRC and the Academy. So one of the things that I've noticed is with the TRC 2015, there's obviously the need to have more Indigenous scholars in the Academy. And some people feel that nothing's been done yet, right? But I want to acknowledge the people who have been doing work for decades. At the University of Manitoba, Dr. Emma LaRocque, in 1975, she wrote a book called Defeathering the Indian. And that was about the anti-Indigenous racism that students experience in the Academy. It wasn't named anti-Indigenous racism then. And before I left the University of Manitoba, I established a speaker series somewhat like this. But I wanted to acknowledge the Indigenous scholars within the University of Manitoba, because I felt there was a lack of acknowledgement of our own Indigenous scholars. So Emma LaRocque came and spoke, and she said, "No one ever asked me to speak here." She gets asked to speak everywhere globally, but the university where she was did not ask her to speak. She also said at that time, not much has changed since she wrote the book in 1975. The racism is still there. What she said was there might be more numbers, but it hasn't changed. Marlene Brandt-Castellano, Dr. Marlene Brandt-Castellano has written extensively about Indigenous knowledges for decades. Marie Baptiste, Dr. James Youngblood, Dr. Gregory Caget, Dr. Leroy Littlebear, Linda Smith, and elders, Drs. Marina and Albert Marshall. They actually wrote about two-eyed seeing, probably a decade and a half ago at least. So I just want that to sit with you, that the advancement of Indigenous knowledge in the academy is not new because of the TRC. There have been many Indigenous scholars who are now retired, who have now passed away, who have done a lot of legwork in the academy. What are the TRC positives? And I do want to preface this by saying the commissioners, did a lot of work. Murray Sinclair now speaks about, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and that we're not focusing enough on the truth. So when I speak this way, I'm not criticizing the work of the commissioners at all. I'm not criticizing the survivors and the thrivers who shared their stories. The TRC positives, it's an opportunity. We have a huge opportunity here. And are we actually taking advantage of that opportunity? Opportunity to expose truth. What I'd like you to do for a moment is maybe not for a moment, maybe for about 10 to 20 years, to not use the term reconciliation. Let's just speak truth. Let's just speak truth for about a decade. Let's recheck, see how things are going, and then see if we can talk about reconciliation, because we're not talking about truth. We need to talk about truth a lot more. Opportunity to incorporate truth into curriculum. Opportunity to start and continue the dialogue on residential schools with Indigenous families. I put this here because what some people don't realize is that a lot of Indigenous families have not talked about residential school experiences. So with the TRC and with the process, this was the first time some people ever spoke about what happened to them in residential school, and sometimes speaking with their grandchildren. First time their grandchildren found out, their grandparents were in residential school, and just understanding that. But how much support has been given to Indigenous families through this Truth and Reconciliation process? Think about that. Are we thinking about the families that are still dealing majorly with intergenerational trauma and grief? It's an opportunity for Indigenous people to be employed to help educate. Opportunity for healing of Indigenous peoples. The challenges: exposing the truth, challenging supremacy of whiteness and dominant narratives. That is a humongous challenge. That settler fragility is real. That white fragility is real. Indigenizing curriculum. I say I have that as a challenge, because what's happening there is it's falling on the shoulders of Indigenous people. There was an elder who was hired at a university to actually support Indigenous students. And that elder was called upon to go to a classroom by a professor who was teaching about residential school. This was this professor's area of expertise, non-Indigenous person, had taught the residential school curriculum, and the next year approached the elder and said, I really had a hard time teaching this curriculum. Can you come help me? So I spoke with this elder to try to help her negotiate the appropriate salary, because she's now teaching, right? And she went to the first class. She shared her experiences of being in residential school. At the end of the class, she started to talk, and it was hard for her to talk about financial compensation at that point. And the professor said, oh, I thought that's what you do here at the university. He never paid her. She left the university. She never got paid. So think about that when you're indigenizing the curriculum, right? Being asked time and time and time again to help people with their curriculum. When I started at Ryerson, it was 2005, and I was asked to guest lecture in so many different classes, right? And that's taking me away from progressing in my career. And I'm helping other people. And what I tell people is I'm done helping non-Indigenous people with their career, to advance them with respect to doing Indigenous work. I'm done. Another situation that happened, I tell a bit of some stories, but they're real. They're my truth. Advancing people's careers. I had an experience lately. So even though I say no a lot, sometimes you're asked something and you realize you fell into the position of the token Indian. I had a recent experience where I found out someone used my name in an application to shirk and didn't tell me, right? I wasn't a PI. I wasn't even a collaborator. I was going to come in and do, I don't know, a talk or something. but they used my name in the SSHRC application and did not tell me. If I used your name in a SSHRC application and didn't tell you, would that be a problem? Maybe, right? And this person is a highly ethical person from their own position. And I had to actually say, like, this is unethical. You can't do this. It's problematic. So when we talk about indigenization and indigenization of research, it's being mindful of who are you asking to help you and how are you compensating them. I think what we have to think about is how are you helping advance Indigenous people's careers, right? That should be what we're talking about here. So when you want to indigenize your curriculum, go and talk to your dean, go and talk to your president, and hire Indigenous people to teach the content, whether they have their PhD or not, depending on what you need to, what knowledge you need to bring forward. Dialogue in Families has not yet had enough supports. I've already mentioned that. I've mentioned a bit about the tokenism, the puppetry, and the palatable Indian. When I talk about the palatable Indian, I really believe that when institutions put in place these positions, and no insult to anybody in this room or to York University or any other institution, when you have a special advisor to the president, you have a special advisor to the dean, right? It's recognizing who do you expect that person to be. Do you want them to challenge you, or do you want them to be the palatable Indian? Do you want them to deal with the Indian problem? If there's something that brews up that's going to hit the media, let's put the Indian person in front, and they will receive all the hits, right? If that's what you want, you get rid of the position, right? You need to get rid of the position. What healing has occurred because of reconciliation efforts. And when I think about that, there has been very little healing, I think, for Indigenous peoples. Reconciliation in the Academy has been mostly about teaching non-Indigenous people about Indigenous things and Indigenous people. And that's important, but there's not enough of us to do that work. Glasses time. Truth before reconciliation. Too many examples of Indigenous people doing reconciliation work to help non-Indigenous people. Job postings going beyond the job description. Taking away from Indigenous progress and achievement. And the expectation of being non-paid. So how ironic. Closed due to the new statutory holiday recognizing Indigenous reconciliation. There we go. I did it. Sean was supposed to be my reader today. I can't emphasize this point enough, right? Sean's in your second year here now at York University, and in order for you to continue to advance, you have to really limit the amount of help you give to other people. But it's that balance, because we want to achieve balance within the institution and we want to help people, and a lot of people will say yes. But if it becomes a detriment to your advancement, that's when you have to reflect. When it comes a detriment to your health, that's when you have to reflect. And I tell new Indigenous scholars or junior Indigenous scholars that non-Indigenous people need you more than you need them. The Tri-Council Policy Statement, Chapter 9, states that you have to engage the Indigenous community in order to get REB approval. A lot of Tri-Council funding is actually requiring you to engage the Indigenous community before you get the money. But by engaging them, that means telling them that their name's on your grant before you submit it. That's not happening, right? And so we have junior scholars coming in being asked to be on everybody's research project. And that's okay, as long as it's in alignment what your research portfolio is, right? And really thinking twice about that. I remember I was asked, and this is when I realized, okay, I'm going to be a token Indian a lot to help people. And someone asked me to be part of their research project. It was on a topic that's very close to me, as well as using the Anishinaabe symbol-based reflection method. So I said yes. It was a small grant. Got the grant. They didn't engage me again. They didn't keep employing the Indigenous student on the project. Didn't hear from the person. Then I got a phone call, maybe an email first, and asking me to be part of a larger submission, a larger SHRC submission. I didn't answer. When you don't get an answer, what's the answer? Anybody? No, right? If you're not getting that answer and you ask again and you ask again, the answer is no. The person might have too much, there's too much going on. So I didn't answer, sent another email, phoned me, and then I emailed back and I said, look, I'm really, really busy right now. I don't have any time available. Person said, well, you don't have to do anything. You don't even have to read it. We just need your signature, right? That was real. Another very real example is an application that someone forged my signature on. I'm not even joking. My signature was forged. And when I asked, like, didn't I have to sign that? Because there were 2 submissions that went into the same stream. And I signed the other one, sent it in by fax back in the day when we did fax machines. I think we still do it with some of our funders. And the person said, oh, can I give you a call? So they phoned me up. They said, oh, I signed it for you. You didn't sign it for me, you forged it. That should have been the first indication that this project was not going to go well. Hashtag reconciliation fail. Reconciliation. The George Stanley verdict. So if you don't know, this was the young man who was shot in the back of the head, who was sleeping in a car when they went onto someone's property. And there were other youth, and the farmer came out and shot the person and shot Colton Bushy. And Colton Bushy died, and there wasn't even a homicide charge, right? This was not murder. It was not murder. So this person was killed, and it didn't matter. That's reconciliation, right? When we were in the cemetery and that survivor was talking, he talked about, you know, the man who impregnated the young children. He talked about names being excluded. And then he would say, so what's reconciliation? You know, what he was saying is like, and then he said in Cree, there's no term for reconciliation. There's no translation for reconciliation. So a lot of people are challenging reconciliation. Our most recent example is Trudeau's appeal of the compensation for First Nations children. Colton Bushy, Tina Fontaine, Cindy Gladue, missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit trans folks. Incarceration rates, child welfare apprehensions, the morbidity and mortality in Indigenous communities, and that should resonate with a lot of the work that you do. Those numbers aren't changing. Reconciliation means, to me, when morbidity and mortality is equal to the rest of the population. Equal. That's all I'm asking for, just equal. The residential school settlement stories being destroyed, that's reconciliation. Anti-Indigenous racism in the academy, that's reconciliation. And indigenization and reconciliation falling on the shoulders of Indigenous people. I don't know if folks saw this, but Kent Roach, are you in the room? No. Kent Roach is at U of T, I believe. He wrote a book, and a week before the book came out, and he was favorable. It was favorable with respect to the murder of Colton Bushy. So he wrote this book, and a week before he contacted the family, and he said, hey, just giving you a heads up, I wrote this book. A week before it was coming out. There's no changing it. There was no changing the photo on that book that had their son on that book. There was no changing. It was a done deal. And what he said was, if we're going to go that way, we would have to get proper ethical permission for dealing with human subjects, Roach said in an interview. That's reconciliation. Under whose terms do we reconcile and indigenize? So, you know, the photo on your right is a photo of my sister's work. And, you know, I take pride in her work. She was a beater, crafter, and that's what people want, right? They want the beads, the feathers, the ceremony, the cultural promotion. But do they want our warriors? Do they want the disruption, the dismantling, and the resisting? When I was in Winnipeg, I went to the Tina Fontaine verdict was coming out, and I got the notice on my phone, and a lot of people were going to go down to the courthouse. So I get down to the courthouse, and all the media was there, and I didn't see Niigaan Sinclair. There's supposed to be people there, and they weren't there. I saw one warrior in fatigue with the warrior flag that you see there. And I went to him and I stood by him and I'm like, oh my gosh, like he was scared too, right? You know, I marched with Colton Bushy and people were saying, you fucking Indians, what are you fucking doing? You're blocking the road. That's what you're facing. So when I see a warrior, I'm going to stand by that warrior. But do we want that? Do we want our warrior societies? When we talk about indigenization, the palatable Indian tokenism of puppetry, the non-threatening, being sensitive to settler fragility, white fragility, not using the terminology white supremacy, white fragility, or white for that matter. Do not challenge the status quo. Marsha Anderson is a physician at the University of Manitoba, and she also did a talk. It was actually, I think, after I left the University of Manitoba. We're going to cycle through all the 40 Indigenous scholars. It's going to take a few years. But she talked about the threshold of tolerance. And when you're in the institution and you're trying to advance Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing, and when you challenge the dominant status quo, you do reach a threshold of tolerance. And you know when you reach that threshold, you feel it. You feel like you're going to get fired. And what Marsha said was, there's a threshold of tolerance, but they don't tell you what the level is. But you know when you hit it. And that's, you know, the wave of resignations and firing that we were seeing has actually stopped. So I'm encouraged by that. I think we're in a different place, a slightly different place right now. I just wanted to add this for the sake of adding it. A lot of people talk about Egerton Ryerson's contribution to residential school, and you know, we need to talk about that. When I was in Winnipeg, Bishop Grandin is named everywhere. There's a big highway called Bishop Grandin, and this is what Bishop Grandin said in 1875. When they graduate from our institutions, the children will have lost everything native except for their blood. They have forgotten their mother tongue, and in this way cannot live native life anymore. We instill in them a pronounced distaste for the native life so that they will be humiliated when reminded of their origin. This man, 1875, he was a man of his time, right? But what impact does this have? Because we are still praising this person. He's named everywhere. And you know what? This has worked. To this day, there's a question, I'm going to jump to it, but there's a question that's going to be asked about what does modern day colonialism look like? And that's what it looks like, right? Distaste for ourselves. But what people don't realize, we have our blood memory, and our blood memory is in us. You know, there's research being done on DNA memory and epigenetics, right? Indigenous traditional healers have been talking about that for thousands and thousands of years. That blood memory is still with us, whether they take our language. I wanted to post this up here, and I realized timing. How are we? So. Okay, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry reports. They do have a longer acronym that is used in the reports. Curriculum, tons of curriculum here. 2 final reports totaling just over 1,100 pages. Supplemental report for the province of Quebec, 175 pages. And there are specific calls to justice for government, human and Indigenous rights related to culture, health and wellness, human security, justice, media and social influencers, health and social service providers, transportation and hospitality providers, police services, attorneys and law societies, educators, social workers, and those implicated in child welfare, extractive and developmental industries, Correctional Services Canada, and for all Canadians. So when you ask what can you do, read the 1,100 pages. There's a supplementary report on the legal analysis of genocide unapologetically positions missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls within colonial violence and gender-based violence. They named this. And what happened when this report came out? What was the debate? The debate was, well, this really wasn't genocide. It totally deflected from everything in these reports, completely deflected. And where are we now with this? I'm going to kind of go a bit quickly through here, but one of the things that happens when we talk about universities being colonial, well-meaning colleagues will say, well, how is the institution colonial? And we were at a TRC committee meeting, and there were about 40 people there, and non-Indigenous, Indigenous, and someone asked, like, well, how is it colonial? And we had a whole list of ways in which the institution is colonial. The institution is colonial when we can't advance with our own ways of knowing, being, and doing, right? I was the chair of the Research Ethics Board for 4 or 5 years, and I love research ethics. And you know, the research ethics process can be quite colonial. Chapter 9 has helped us quite a bit, but one of the things that people don't recognize is Chapter 9 has not dealt adequately with intellectual property. Because whoever collects, if I collect stories from you, I own your story. You collect your knowledge with me and I own your story based on the Copyright Act, and that's problematic. So we haven't dealt with, there are many examples of colonial systems in the academy. And I bring these 2 examples to you, the pyramid of white supremacy and the racism scale. And I'm going to just give a shout out to Ry Moran. He's the director of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. And he brought my attention to the racism scale. Where do you fall? And I cannot read that from here. But the Performative Ally. This is something, if you don't do anything, go and look at some of the literature on the Performative Ally. And look at how, you know, you're well-meaning, you want to do this, but how do you become that performative ally? One of the people who questioned me about being divisive would tell you he's doing everything possible to help Indigenous people, and it's never enough. That's the performative ally, right? It's putting yourself in front of the work of Indigenous people, right? Rather than supporting your career, how can you support an Indigenous scholar's career in this academy? I'm going to go quickly through these ones. What do we aspire to do? My next generation living longer. I'm the oldest person in my family. I'm 53. I'm letting my white hair grow in. It's growing in very poorly, but you know, having the next generation live longer, having a better quality of life, being spiritually healthy, living with ceremony, understanding identity and being proud of who you are, safe and affordable housing, obtaining educational level people aspire to attain, contributing to the next generation being even more healthy. I repeat that quite often. Free from lateral violence, giving or taking, and free from anti-Indigenous racism. I believe that's the last slide, but I do want to share the piece about free from anti-Indigenous racism. One of the things I wanted to work on when I was at the University of Manitoba, as I was a vice provost, was ways in which we can deal with the anti-Indigenous racism that our students, faculty, and staff are experiencing on a daily basis. And the complaint-driven processes within the institution are not working. They are not working, and I wanted to focus on ways in which we can have an impact. So we can have an impact by educating non-Indigenous people about really racist comments that people make that are unintended, but they're actually racist. You know, so that's part of that. But how do we deal with the person who has experienced this anti-Indigenous racism day in and day out? And these are the students who you don't see back in your classroom. We need to do something about that. I think that's it. Miigwech. I heard a whoop.
I want to thank Professor Lavallée so much for that talk. And I'm holding too many things.
That's okay. Oh,
thank you so much.
thank you. Miigwech.
I'm really reflecting on how how I want us to keep our minds open to what we could do, because we've heard so many things that we need to do. And I think I'm hoping that we don't shut down to just the level of what we think is possible and keep thinking about what we creatively can do, because we can do a lot. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Um,
Can I sit?
I'm now, oh, please present. Yeah.
I'm going to grab this.
So I'm now going to ask Professors Hillier and Morrow to come up and join Professor Lavallée on stage in the chair of your choosing. And so what we're about to do is it's a facilitated discussion, or Q&A. And I'm going to give this mic over in a second. So I'm just going to give, just to introduce Professors Hillier and Morrow, and then do a mic switch, and then we're going to move to the next thing. Okay, so Dr. Sean Hillier in the middle is a queer Mi'kmaq scholar from the Kalapu First Nation. He's assistant professor in the School of Health Policy and Management and special advisor to the Dean on Indigenous Resurgence. Sean's research focuses on how policy shapes and impacts healthcare for Indigenous peoples in Canada. And Professor Marina Morrow, on the far side from me, is professor and chair of the School of Health Policy and Management at York University. Marina's research explores mental health reform and access to health services, mental health and social inequity, neoliberal reform, gender and health, and intersectional approaches to mental health. So what's going to happen now for the next, let's see how many-ish, 45-ish, or maybe half an hour. Yeah, we'll see. Because Professor Lavallee's answered some of our questions already. But for the next 30 to 45 minutes, we'll have a facilitated discussion to get Professor Lavallee's views and opinions on the issues of colonization, research, and teaching, and how we can move forward on a path of decolonizing, both in our faculty and at the university. So this is going to be a facilitated session, and there's not going to be Q&A from the audience, just to let you know. So let me just do a mic switch here.
So I'll start off while the mic switch happens. But first off, thank you so much for coming and sharing with us today. Very insightful, great deal of experience, with a lot of what you talked about and experiencing racism on a daily basis. I've walked with you downtown and experienced racism being directed at you. And so the first question I have is, what does modern day colonization look like in the city of Toronto?
Okay. I alluded to that a little bit, and I just think about York University is a little bit different, and the community up here where Ryerson is located, it's actually close to Regent Park, and what it looks like is homelessness, right? What it looks like is physicians, Indigenous people who are physicians, and being questioned about their credentials, right? It looks like students going to classrooms and being asked not to sit with other Indigenous students so that they can help educate other students in the classroom. It looks like Halloween costumes with headdresses. What it looks like, how it plays out, and I'm going to probably jump to other questions, are the morbidity and mortality statistics that we see in Indigenous communities. Very quick answer.
Great, thank you. Lynn, I just wanted to thank you also for your presentation, and one of the things that I really took away was your comments about truth before reconciliation. And so just continuing in that vein, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about, and you just started to, tell us a little bit about what does colonization look like in healthcare settings. And many of the people in the audience here either work or engage with healthcare settings, so it'd be helpful for your thoughts on that.
It's hard for me to talk about this without getting very personal, and it's the reason why I entered into the area of doing research with respect to morbidity and mortality in Indigenous communities, and my statistics are not very good. My mom died at 55 from lung cancer, my dad from 69 at lung cancer, my sister Kim at 52 from a methadone overdose administered by the methadone physician, and my sister Susanna at 50 from cancer. So for me, with respect to the healthcare system, I unfortunately have a lot of experience with that. I'll just go to my sister Kim, who died from a methadone overdose. She had degenerative disc disease and had multiple surgeries and got addicted to oxycodone and Percocets and was on fentanyl. And then they took her off the fentanyl, and doctors started to get worried about being caught over prescribing fentanyl. I'm a big pharma critic, so prepare for that. And then took her off the oxys cold turkey, right? And no supports at all. And so she was trying to get oxys on the street, was taking her Percocets, was taking her gabapentin, and started attending a methadone clinic, because methadone is harm reduction. It's not supposed to kill you, right? But we know that the methadone overdose death rates are very high in the first 2 weeks of someone going on methadone. They administered her 30 milligrams of methadone the first 4 days. 30 milligrams of methadone based on the CPS is the maximum dosage, starting dosage for people who are, shooting up and, very, very, like if you want to equate or give a hierarchy to addictions. My sister wasn't there. And they started her at 30 milligrams. She had COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. The CPS talks about the fact that methadone is contraindicated for people with lung disease because it's a respiratory suppressant. And on day 5, she went into the clinic and was experiencing overdose symptoms. And they increased her to 40 milligrams. And they gave her 40 milligrams that day, 40 milligrams the next day, and she died on day 7. So when you talk about colonization in the healthcare system, that's what it looks like. But it also looks like, with this overdose, a letter was sent to the College of Physicians and Surgeons, and they responded back with a 7 or 8 page letter and had indicated they didn't understand why she was started at 30 milligrams, right? She clearly had 50% lung capacity. The physician was an emergency hospital physician, and he should have been aware of this. They did not double check to see if she was still prescribed her Percocets and gabapentin, which she was. It's double doctoring, and the college is supposed to check for that. And they had no understanding as to why they increased her to 40 milligrams on day 5. And what the college suggested was that the physician undergo some education. And there's no legal ramifications. So my sister Kim is part of the class action lawsuit for oxycodone right now, because the pharmaceutical company did not disclose the accuracy with respect to the addiction rates. And she's part of that class action lawsuit. She's gone, right? And unfortunately, other members of my family are part of that class action lawsuit too. So that's what it looks like. Big pharma, profiting. Sorry.
No, thank
We
you.
got to crack a joke now.
Thank you for sharing that story. What's interesting in post-secondary education, as well as in our academies right now, we're really about the buzzwords. And the buzzwords are decolonization, indigenization, resurgence, all these different types of things of how we can, try to bring, Indigenous people into the academy and the knowledges that are there. So can you explain to us what is meant by the word decolonization and what this might look like in action for individuals?
Mm-hmm. I at the position where I do not want to use the terminology reconciliation, indigenization, or decolonization. I'm not here to decolonize this academy. I want to live a little bit longer. I can't see us decolonizing the academy when our funding is reliant on government. We can't decolonize that. So I think it's great for people to use those buzzwords, but where they're used a lot of times are in PR materials, right? And you can see it, when people use that terminology just to give yourself a pat on the back, right? So for me, I think the indigenization is important so that Indigenous people will feel comfortable in the academy. That's the ultimate goal, right? And in order to feel comfortable, people have to learn what anti-Indigenous racism looks like. But the onus is on you to learn what that looks like, not on Indigenous people, right? So for me, I don't like to use those three terms. Coming back to Ryerson, I have a position in the Faculty of Community Services, and I sat with this for a while and thought about defeathering the Indian, right? Emma LaRocque wrote that book in 1975, and my elder, Vern Harper, he used to tell me, we have been defeathered, right? And we need to gather those feathers, we need to gather our bundles, we need to make ourselves healthy, we need to go to our ceremony, we need to go to the land, we need to go to our language, and that is resurgence. And it's about it's about focusing on the success of Indigenous people in the way they see success within these academic walls. And I think that non-Indigenous people, that it's important that non-Indigenous people learn as well. But as for me, I'm one person, and I want to focus on Indigenous people being successful in the academy. I don't know what your statistics are here. We really should actually work on this across Canada with, what are the success rates for Indigenous students, right? First Nations, Métis, Inuit, typically those are the three classifications when we're doing this qualitative assessment.
Thank you. In your talk, you gave a lot of very kind of chilling examples of kind of experiences you've had in the research world and being sort of used in a tokenistic way. I wondered if you could sort of talk on the positive side. What does good research look like in an Indigenous context? And what might be some good examples of research in that vein?
I think good research actually produces Indigenous researchers, right? That's the outcome. And hiring Indigenous students, and you'll hear a response back, well, there's not enough Indigenous students. And there are Indigenous students out there. One of the most amazing projects I worked on was at Anishinaabe Health, and we got funding Anishinaabe Health got funding from the Toronto Central Lynn's to do a project. And of course, they give you the money March 1st, and you have to have it spent by March 30th. That's how it works. And they might have given it up to us in December, and we had to actually do a fairly large project. And we hired all Indigenous folks on the project. We did our recruitment. They knew where the students were, or where the research participants were. It was a project on diabetes. And it was about capacity building for those Indigenous students. There was only one non-Indigenous person on that project, who was my co-PI, who's really embedded in the community. And that to me is what good Indigenous research looks like.
Thank you for that. And Lynn and I will have a forthcoming publication about what not good research will look like in a larger team context that I had the opportunity to participate in during my PhD studies. And so another question that I have is really around, as a new scholar, and then I speak with lots of community organizations, very kind of embedded with a number of community organizations in downtown Toronto, and they talk about how they're inundated with students that come down and want to do placements with them, want to gain knowledge from them. And so one of the questions that I have is, should non-Indigenous students and or researchers be doing research with Indigenous peoples or communities? And if so, how do they go about doing that?
That's always a tricky question. I think that there are non-Indigenous people who do research with Indigenous peoples in a good way. And I think there are Indigenous peoples who do research with Indigenous peoples in a good way. So prefacing with that, I personally want to give opportunity to Indigenous students and Indigenous researchers. I don't have time. I do not have time at this point to help other folks, and that's Indigenous resurgence for me. And it's, I don't want to be apologetic about that, but it has to do with capacity, right? I only have so much time, and that's what I'd like to do. I've had arguments, as you know, with people about supporting Indigenous students and non-Indigenous students, and someone made a comment to me one time, Well, if I didn't get the opportunity to work with the Indigenous community, I wouldn't be here today. What I say is, who didn't have the opportunity to be here today because you took that spot, right? It's being mindful of the space that you're taking up. And how can you have an impact still, though, right? How can you have an impact? You're a service provider. Dr. Barry Lavallée talks about this. He talks about moving beyond the social determinants of health. You are a service provider, and how does your I won't use unconscious bias or bias. How does your internal the racism that the embedded racism that is within you impact your client? So Barry Lavallée talks about Indigenous or physicians, future physicians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and recognizing how, you know, they might look at a patient who comes in and, you know, Brian Sinclair is an example of this, right? Brian Sinclair sat in the emergency room for 36 hours and he died in the emergency and nobody knew, right? And people looked at him and thought, oh, he's a drunk, right? All he needed, he got a piece of paper from his family doctor, and he needed his catheter changed, right? That's all he needed to avoid an infection. He had that piece of paper with him, and he sat in that hospital for 36 or 38 hours and died. Kind of going off on a tangent there, so I'm going to come back a little bit. If you don't know about Brian Sinclair, and I think Barry Lavallée will be coming here to speak, and he talks about that. He was an expert witness with respect to the Brian Sinclair inquiry.
Thanks for reminding us of that. It's a very sad story, a difficult story. I wondered, just along this, you know, as we talk about these sort of relationships, I mean, maybe it's better to think about this in terms of how non-Indigenous students and non-Indigenous researchers could be better allies to Indigenous folks within the university, but also within communities. Do you have any sort of thoughts about that?
Friends. You know, when I was doing my master's, I was made to feel like I didn't belong, and people would, I wouldn't tell people anything about my background, and people found out I grew up in Regent Park, and one of my colleagues said, wow, you grew up in Regent Park, how does it feel to have an office here? And I went, how do you feel having an office here? Right? It's we're very similar, right? And I think finding those similarities and just letting people be. I don't know how else to explain that.
So one of the struggles that we have across this country is about Indigenous representation at the post-secondary level, especially those that are qualified by kind of these Western standards to be able to teach our students. And that, you know, we continue to see year after year postings go out and many of them are failing. And so we have this kind of this gap of Indigenous people that can provide the knowledge on to students, and we struggle with that here in the Faculty of Health. Many of our undergraduate courses that are Indigenous health-based are not being taught by Indigenous faculty. I teach a class that's Indigenous health-based with 30 students. And we have lots of students that keep coming. You know, we have program administrators here, and they always get emails. They're saying, how can I get into 3012? How can I get into 3012? So how do we go about, as an institution where we lack capacity at an Indigenous kind of level to teach students who want this information, how can non-Indigenous faculty members teach students about Indigenous issues, especially given that many students are craving this knowledge and wanting to have this knowledge because they recognize that they will be encountering Indigenous people in the healthcare setting once they leave kind of the confines of academia?
And you shared with me that you're the only Indigenous person in this faculty.
I am, yes.
So, you know, that's an immediate challenge because you can't go and guest lecture for everybody. And I don't know how much money you give for honorariums for people to come into your classroom, but that's not really always the answer. But there are people out there, if you have the budget to bring people into the classroom, there are people out there who are willing to come. Ryan McMahon talks about reconciliation being an industry. And there are people holding traditional knowledge who have the knowledge that will be helpful in your classrooms. And it's identifying who those people are, bringing people in with the specific expertise that you require, but paying them, right? How many folks here have done consulting? I know there's a few.
A couple,
We
yeah.
don't actually tell our bosses that we do consulting. But would you take $100 for 2 hours for a consulting fee? No. Would you take, I don't know, $200 for 3 hours? No. A daily rate for a consulting fee is $1,000 maybe, $1,200, $1,500. But if you're asking someone to come into your classroom who has a specific expertise, what are you willing to pay them? If you can't pay them, don't invite them, right? And then if you're asking Indigenous people at your institution, including Sean or other staff, to come into your classroom, how is that taking away from the advancement of their own position at the university and thinking about that, right? Because we won't provide an honorarium to Sean, he gets paid enough already, but you're supposed to laugh at that.
I wasn't
gosh.
really.
Okay.
It's like the dean is in
Oh,
here.
the
I'm
dean
not
is
supposed
in
to
here.
laugh.
Okay. You don't give honorariums to folks who are within your own institution, so, you know, but it takes away from the work that you need to do, right? But I want to back up a little bit, because that's the immediacy. But what we need to do is we need to bring more Indigenous students into your programs. So the University of Manitoba and the Indigenous people there have done some pretty amazing work. There's an access program that's been in place for about 30 years. That's how Barry Lavallée got through the medical school. He came in through the access program. He didn't meet the minimum criteria. He had the intelligence, but he had just life circumstances that challenged him. And he entered into that program, and he graduated, and he's been a physician for, you know, a couple of decades. We need more of these programs that are very specific, where we have champions who are actually delivering the program. And they can't be a cost cutting or a program that, what word am I looking for, when you achieve the costs of your program, letting it so many students in. I mean, you're going to lose money, basically. That's what it comes down to, right? So in these programs, you need to provide supports for Indigenous students and create that avenue. At Ryerson, we have a partnership with First Nations Technical Institute. So it's creating those avenues specific to your disciplines, so specific to nursing, specific to kinesiology. And then from there, nurturing that development from undergrad to master's to PhD. So we don't just have Sean sitting here. And then as far as scholars bouncing around from institution to institution, when I talk to Indigenous scholars who are doing that, that's just something that happens in the academy anyway. It's not just Indigenous people. And I tell people, go where you want to be, go where the land is calling you, as opposed to the colonial institution, because they're all colonial institutions.
So in some ways you've started to get into the question that I was going to ask you, and I was thinking earlier in your talk where you mentioned all the different Indigenous academics who've been working for decades really on these issues within the university, within many universities across Canada. But in many ways, our Faculty of Health here is in some very beginning stages, as you know. Mm-hmm. And so I think one of the things that we're struggling with, or I guess looking to our speakers here in this series to sort of support us with, is thinking about, what do we do next, or how do we, go forward on this this venture. And so some of the things that you started to talk about in terms of, increasing the student body, et cetera. Are there other sort of pieces of advice that you would have for us around this?
When it comes to health, we have to teach about Indigenous health. So non-Indigenous people are going to have to do that. It has to happen, right? We have to talk about the statistics, but we also have to talk about and celebrate the strengths of Indigenous people. So a lot of times in these sorts of disciplines, we are focusing on the morbidity and mortality, which takes us down that path of intergenerational trauma. and historical grief, and it's important to understand that, but it's also important to understand that Indigenous peoples are thriving, right? A lot of survivors of residential schools are now using the terminology, I'm a thriver, not a survivor. And there's so much strength. So in kinesiology, for example, so that's the school that I came from, and you know, there's so many movements in Canada. I'm the president of the Aboriginal Sports Circle, and we have the North American Indigenous Games. The reason why the calls to action talk about sport is because Wilton Littlechild is on there. That's his background. They ensured that sport was included in the calls to action. So when you're teaching about, you know, the morbidity and mortality, you know, big pharma and the capitalization on Indigenous communities, also teach about the strengths, right? So it's the onus is on the instructor, the faculty member to learn that and get it right. And it's hard to get it right. When we talk about indigenizing curriculum, you know, how many people, this is a health faculty, so it might be the wrong question, but how many people would be comfortable teaching algebra, right? We are going to make algebra a requirement across the entire university, and now you as a faculty member have to learn that and teach it. And that's what we're doing with indigenization of curriculum. But you can do it. You can explore, and without getting people to be guest lectures in your class time and time again. Finding out, I think your first, you know, one of the things we're doing really everywhere across Canada is what is the foundational knowledge you need in order to deliver this curriculum? What is the foundational knowledge you need to teach in order that service practitioners, nurses, and physicians are not going to do more harm when they have an Indigenous patient? Identity is one of those pieces, right? Who are First Nations? What is the Indian Act? What are the treaties? You know, who are the Métis? What's going on with the Manitoba Métis Federation right now and Indigenous identity? Identity is tied to health. There's a lot of literature with respect to identity and health. So you can do that, and at this point that has to happen, right? You only have one Indigenous member to do that. So, you know, with the indigenization of curriculum, you have a specialist, I believe, in different faculties. Bring someone in to, you know, someone carrying Indigenous knowledge to help with that, and having them be like, you know, Sean's a special advisor to the dean, right? You can't do this curriculum work; it's impossible. But having all the faculties hire an Indigenous person who carries Indigenous knowledge respective to that discipline or the disciplines within that faculty, and hire them full-time, benefits, right? Position. That's what we need to do.
Excellent. Thank you, Lynn. I think that this is an important kind of piece because I have lots of faculty that naturally come and say, oh, I want to bring in a guest speaker, or can you speak? And typically, the immediate want is around trauma, right? It's always trauma-based. It's like, oh, have somebody come in and tell their story who has survived horrible traumas so it can impact my students and they can learn about indigeneity. And we'll talk about, you know, residential schools, and we'll talk about the 60 Scoop and addiction and like all those traumas, and, you know, trying to reframe that around how can we talk about resilience? How can we talk about the thriving populations that Indigenous people have resisted, call it like genocide, have resisted, like the intent, you know, of the Canadian government was to commit a genocide. And so how did Indigenous people survive that? What are the promising practices that we currently see today that are allowing Indigenous people to live you know, healthier lives than they have in the past? And how do we continue to push that forward so that we can have that equality of health statistics that we so desperately want? The last question I have for you is, how can a faculty of health meaningfully engage with its local Indigenous communities? And what may that look like? We really struggled. So, you know, I think York has recognized that we are behind the game of most GTA universities when it comes to kind of pushing forward indigenizing. And I think a core aspect of that is that we can't do this at this institution alone, that we need to form those relationships, those bonds at its core in order to push forward. And so what does that meaningful engagement with those local Indigenous communities look like, especially given that we have actual First Nations communities in our area, but we also have a very large urban Indigenous community as well?
Mm-hmm. Gosh, that's a really difficult question, because from a university standpoint to a faculty standpoint to an individual researcher standpoint, it looks different, right? And a lot of universities have advisory councils. So in Ontario, the reason why the is yours called the Indigenous Education Council?
No, just Indigenous Council.
Indigenous Council. The reason why those councils exist is the province had money. And in order to send the money to the academic institutions, you have to put a council together. So universities put councils together. The councils are supposed to decide from a community-based standpoint how that money is spent. How that looks across Ontario is very different. And unfortunately, with these councils, a lot of people, the same people are doing the same work, right? Especially in cities. In Manitoba, all of the academic institutions had cultural advisory committees to the president. And it was the same people on the same committees, and many people couldn't show up to all the meetings because there's just too many meetings, right? So how do you do consultation is without, that fatigue, right? You talk about researcher fatigue. There's consultation fatigue. There was an elder at University of Manitoba. His name just escaped me. That's terrible. Norman. And he talked about the 3 C's: consultation, communication, and collaboration. So a lot of times there's consultation, and it's not really consultation because there's no communication, right? There's nothing, there's no feedback that comes back, there's no collaboration. So I've been at meetings where slides are put up, yep, we consulted with 35 Indigenous faculty and 55 community members, and they identify that consultation, but there's no discussion about the collaboration and the communication, right? So if you're putting something together, that has to happen. I think for individual researchers, you have to do the work. You have to develop those relationships, and those relationships may not be your typical relationships. If anybody does CBR work, community-based research work, it's developing long-term relationships with community. Developing those relationships before you actually apply for the funding, and working with the community once you get that funding. The objectives of the research really should come from community. Going backwards to the community after the fact is not okay. It's highly unethical. And I think it's just simply developing those relationships. So I think about how I do this, right? When people ask me the question, like, well, how do I do this? I don't knock on people's doors, right? And maybe I'm privileged enough in my career now where I don't have to do that, but I never really did that, except maybe certain projects. But it's about community coming to you, right? And identifying, well, you have a certain strength that we need, and how can we work together? And, I've had people come to me wanting me to help them develop their relationship with community so that they can conduct research, and I never, ever, ever do that. It's one piece of advice I give to Indigenous scholars and Indigenous students, because fundamentally it's my research integrity. If I screw up in community, that impacts my niece, that impacts my grandnephews. It doesn't just impact my career, right? So that's why integrity is so important. So I do not develop relationships for people, right? I'm Anishinaabe Métis, and I'm not Haudenosaunee. I've had people, say, I want to do research at 6 Nations. Can you help me develop a relationship? It's like, no, you have to do that yourself. If you don't know how to start that, you have to do the work to figure out how to start it in the first place. And maybe if you're having difficulty developing that relationship, you shouldn't do that research. I've also had a student who was First Nations who wanted to do research with the Métis. And I said, so how do you find the Métis in Toronto? I don't know. Who are the Métis? Person didn't know. You shouldn't do that research. right? If you don't understand the people that you're wanting to do research on. Helpful?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great answer. Perfect.
Positive note? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
No.
No, I think, I hope that people leave feeling a bit more energized than when you came in the room, and not worrying about doing something wrong. And just go and read, the reports. Go and read that report about the children in residential school, right, who are in mass graves. So go and do that work, and please don't take offense to anything that I said.
Before we finish, I think that's an do the work as academics. I think when we have academics or graduate students or undergraduate students that want to do work, we say, oh, you want to use a new method, or you want to do quantitative research now. It's like, well, you have to go and research that and do the work to understand, to be able to undertake it. But a lot of people have an expectation that, oh, I don't need to do the work to understand Indigenous methods, Indigenous knowledges. I can go to an Indigenous person and they will do that for me. And we don't have that expectation from a Western perspective. And I find it very interesting that we see lots of academics say, oh, somebody else will do this as a part of my research. You should innately know the research methods, the knowledge perspectives that you are going to be working with when you do research as a researcher, and that can't come from just the Indigenous person or people on your research project, but that you also need to do that work to educate yourself.
Yeah, and know the community. Like I do reviews all the time, and I read people's manuscripts, and they'll use terminology like First Nations or Indigenous, but it's actually research that was done in one First Nations community. So Chandler and Lavallée did research on suicide, and they looked at First Nations communities in BC specifically, and looked at suicidality and cultural continuity. So communities that, more people spoke the language and really connected to culture, and they came up with the conclusion that communities that have less cultural continuity have more suicide. And then I talked about that in my class in Ontario with the First Nations Institute First Nations Technical Institute students, and they're like, "What? That's bullshit." Right? Like, because it doesn't translate. So people say, well, they apply that overall throughout Canada, and that's something that researchers do a lot, right? You'll take one study and you'll generalize it, because generalizability is the most important thing with quantitative research, right? And it's wrong. We can't generalize. Our communities are so different. Even within the Métis community, there's huge differences within the Métis community and even the First Nations community. So especially when it comes to morbidity and mortality and all of the social determinants of health. Before my sister Suzanne passed away, she went to the doctor and she had really advanced cancer, stage 4, and she asked the doctor, like, what happened? Why do I have this cancer? And he gave the example of when you throw one pebble in the lake, you see the ripples. It's called Mizwibik. You see the ripples, and that rock caused the ripples. But if you throw 1,000 rocks in the water, you don't know which rock caused which ripple. And that's what's going on in Indigenous communities. There's so much happening. So approaching research in that way. But as researchers, we want to compartmentalize and make things a little bit easier, and they're not that easy.
Excellent.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Lynn. I don't want to get kicked out of here, so we will wrap that up. So please, everybody, join me in thanking Lynn.
Thank you. Thank you.